Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, your regular host. On today's episode, we're going to touch something that we haven't, I think, spoke about at all. Spoken about a number of episodes about intelligence and gathering information in operations, that being Sparrow Force in Timor, with Major Guy Warnock, one of the SAS operators that infilled into Indefet. We haven't talked about counterintelligence. It sounds to me like a dark art. I'm not an intelligence officer, but we're going to talk about and explore counterintelligence in some sort of great detail. My guest today is MAJ Paul Patty. He's an intelligence officer whose skills have been relied upon, particularly in counterintelligence, in both the government and private sectors. He's currently doing the part-time command and staff course. So thank you for taking your time out from study to record today, sir.
My pleasure, Todd. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Now, I think when we spoke off air about designing this episode, we talked about sort of, the easy way would be to define counterintelligence. What is it different? And we'll get to that eventually. But I think the first thing we need to go through is somewhat of a case study to explain how counterintelligence works in a good and bad way. So we landed on and we talked about World War II, and there's a few examples that no doubt will come out throughout the episode. But I think the more contemporary, and something we haven't touched a lot on in the podcast itself, was the Russia-Ukraine conflict. There's been some obviously offensive, large-scale manoeuvres that have happened. Russia trying to Ukraine 2023 conducting a large offensive and sort of going to a level of detail in planning to enable that. But then Russia being aware of what the plans were and inevitably it not succeeding as well as it should have. Can we talk about that conflict and then sort of how is counterintelligence used in both an active and passive or offensive and defensive means?
Sure. I think Russia-Ukraine is a really good example of, in some ways, a nightmare scenario almost for counterintelligence in the modern battlefield. Now, of course, most people would be aware, and most of your listeners would be aware, that the lead up to the invasion in 2022 was foreshadowed by a series of now what appears to be a deception military exercises, postings of troops and staging of forces in Belarus and surrounding areas around Ukraine in order to provide the springboard and the assembly areas for the eventual invasion of that country. But what is not well known or as well researched and documented is that prior to this, there was a very long and very deliberate campaign of infiltration by Russia's intelligence forces and intelligence services, be they both military and civilian, into the Ukrainian government, Ukraine's military, the country, and the civilian population. And so specific elements of Russia's military intelligence apparatus, being the GRU as it's commonly known, or elements of the FSB, Russia's internal security service as well, with responsibility for former Soviet territories, spent many years, and by some open source reports, something in the order of about $1 billion building influence networks, human intelligence networks, and establishing technical architecture and infrastructure within Ukraine so that they could firstly gather intelligence on what was happening in the country, use that to shape their battle plans and their operations, arguably quite poorly as it turns out. But the intent was there to know what was going on the ground, and also to really prepare almost collaborationist elements within the government and the civilian population so that when Russia went in, as it did in those opening days, not expecting a huge amount of hostility, that there would be at least a nucleus of the population, in addition to the ethnic Russians and so on that were living in Ukraine, that would be ready to rise up and support their effort to take over that country. Now, I think part of the reason that they were perhaps so lackadaisical in their initial foray into Ukraine, the fact that they didn't employ sound tactics and operational security procedures and all-round defence and all that sort of stuff that we teach all of our people to do when they're conducting offensive manoeuvres. I think part of the reason that they didn't do that is because they had complacency and they had a sense of comfort that the ground, in a sense, had already been prepared for them, and that they would move in and occupy positions and go to towns and stuff where they had infrastructure in place and, in effect, it wasn't hostile territory. Now, of course, it didn't turn out that way, and my suspicion is, and all I can say is it is a suspicion, is that many of those agents or the operations which are the Russians and the Russian intelligence was operating and running in Ukraine were in fact playbacks by the Ukrainians, that they were double agents in many cases. And I shudder to think how much money the Russians handed over to sources in Ukraine, which ultimately ended up going into the Ukrainian government's coffers for either more intelligence operations back against Russia or simply for them to buy arms or whatever. But a perennial feature of that conflict has been intelligence penetration, the use of human agents, technical infiltration, foreign interference and things like cyber disruption and so on, and especially human agents responsible for stealing or leaking secret information. And mostly that's been on the part of the Russians successfully recruiting individuals within Ukraine. Now, to those who've been observant in what's been going on in that area, Zelensky himself has been responsible for removing senior Ukrainian intelligence officers and politicians who they found years now after the invasion were working for the Russians the whole time. Earlier this year, the head of the counterterrorism unit or the counterterrorism division within the Ukrainian SBU, which is Ukraine's kind of internal security service and internal intelligence agency, that guy who held the rank of colonel or something was found to be working for the Russians for many years. So you have this complex kind of environment where the very institutions and government agencies that you are relying upon to wage war against your attacker and to mount your defense have been thoroughly penetrated, are leaking information, and have been turned by the enemy, which is a very devilish problem. And you can just imagine what that does to morale for the guys on the front line, for the commanders who are out there trying to effect that defense and to counterattack the Russians and whatever. How can you have confidence or full faith that your country is behind you to do that if you find out you've got a whole lot of rats in the ranks?
So is it like you talked a lot about shaping then, or sort of pre-H sort of stuff to preempt sort of things happening and then adapt your plans accordingly? Does it obviously this is a loaded question, but counterintelligence not just in the shaping, but in the constant sort of it is at a constant iteration, and they're trying to counter that narrative and provide. We're going to get into active and passive measures in a moment, but is it constant throughout the entire conflict?
I think it not only is counterintelligence a necessity as a constant factor within a conflict scenario, it is a necessary feature of everyday life, right? There is no distinction in the intelligence world between peace and war. And counterintelligence has to be employed and we have to be cognizant of it, either in peacetime as we may perceive it or in wartime, because the intelligence war really never ends. I mean, there's an old German movie, I think from the 1920s or 30s, and the Soviets, the KGB sometimes employed this term of the invisible front, that there was a constant battle going on and that there were people who were permanently engaged in waging war or collecting information on behalf of their country, and that was a conflict which in a sense never ended. And I think, if we think back to sort of the end of the Second World War period, that's a lesson that the Americans had to learn where they had not had a history of engaging in foreign wars. They hadn't really had any history of engaging in overseas intelligence activities. And come the end of the Second World War, they very quickly realised that not only was their battle against the Germans and the Japanese, but the Soviets had been collecting intelligence on them as well, and their wartime allies actually were then their future foes. So, which is something that Australia in a way learnt as well, and maybe we'll touch on that later.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk to allies and working it, but I think the most obvious is enemy, or like sort of adversary forces, I suppose. If we come back to sort of defining, I suppose, what counterintelligence is versus intelligence, and being like information that's been analysed to be able to use to give enemy picture or to enable some sort of planning and decision and action. Let's talk about the difference between counterintelligence. What is counterintelligence? How is it different to intelligence?
So as you mentioned, intelligence is primarily concerned with the collection of information, which is then analysed, compared to other sources to come up with some best guess, really. That's often what it comes down to. Maybe my colleagues won't appreciate that flippant remark, but it's a judgment as to what you think is going to happen to inform commanders or strategic type decisions in order that they can be made with the best information available to them. Now, counterintelligence is basically the antithesis of that, right? So it's looking for where the enemy, and I use that term specifically, I'll come back to that in a minute, but where the enemy in a military context is conducting its own intelligence activities and operations, right? They are collecting their own information. They are analysing that themselves to inform their own decisions. Counterintelligence is occupied with identifying how they are collecting that information, what information is known to them, determining what they intend to do with it, and then figuring out ways that basically you can mess that cycle up. So can you neutralise, for example, the adversary's ability to collect information by denying them a sensor or a collector which they use to get that information in? Or can you manipulate the feeds which are being given to them so that they have an erroneous picture of what's going on out there, or they make bad decisions at the end of the day? Now, I mentioned the term enemy before. Now, in this context, what we're talking about here is not just the enemy as we would conceive of it in conventional military terms. Of course, it's really anyone who has intent, whether they be a state actor or a non-state actor, to collect upon us and our capabilities. Now, that may be the enemy in a given war zone, but it could also be other, let's say, less than friendly countries, maybe other hostile countries, and I'll use countries as the example. But it could be non-state actors who are in the battle space or in the region. It could also be our notional friends and allies, because there's the old saying that there is no such thing as a friendly intelligence service. All countries maintain some mechanism or some apparatus for the collection of information and the dissemination and consumption of intelligence. And at the end of the day, self-interest rules. It's a sort of given law of international relations that these sorts of things will occur, and notwithstanding transient, transactional and diplomatic alliances and so on, there is an ever-present risk, as I mentioned earlier, whether it be in peacetime or wartime, that you will be collected upon, or that people will take an interest in Australia and its capabilities.
I think if we go back to, I had a recon corporal, a patrol commander come on, and he was talking about, conducting reconnaissance, that being close target reconnaissance, but also observation posts and then switching sort of his, I suppose, patrol from that offensive tactic of like gathering information to then denying the enemy the ability to observe and disrupt form-up points, and as the friendly force, main force steps off from that LD, denying routes in and out, and that sort of counterintelligence, switching between gathering and then gathering and protecting. If we talk about what are the key concepts of sort of counterintelligence, there are four. What are they?
Well, maybe it's useful to draw on that analogy, because I think it's an apt one. Counterintelligence can be likened to military reconnaissance tasks in many ways. So, for example, if you're an infantry patrol commander or something, you might send a detachment or a patroller out looking for where the enemy is, because you don't know where they are, or you think they're in this general vicinity, but you need to make contact with them either visually or by fire or whatever it may be, so that you can get a fix on where they are and then determine what you need to do from that. Now, counterintelligence is very, very similar to that. You might know in the abstract sense that the enemy's sensors are out there trying to collect on you through technical means to recruit your people, to turn members of the civilian population who may be non-aligned or favourable to your mission, whatever it might be, right? And the point of this whole stuff is too, like it's intended to be secret. That's the intent behind it. So it's not often as easy as just looking out there and putting binoculars up and saying, "Oh, I've found the Foreign Intelligence Service." Of course, the whole point is that it's opaque. So you need some way to flush that out, and you need some way, to borrow a phrase used by an American author, to maintain contact with the enemy. And he was a guy who, Richard Johnson, I think his name was, who had served in the infantry during the Second World War and then went to work in the CIA and worked in counterintelligence. And he saw this connection. He was like, well, the stuff that we used to do in the Battle of the Bulge to flush out enemy elements and find where they were, determine where the Germans, what their strength was and all that sort of stuff is very similar to what CIA was doing against the KGB, for example. So I think that analogy very much applies there, and that's a good way of thinking about it. But like any other military operation, counterintelligence has defensive and offensive aspects to it, right? So the defensive stuff is that which we generally consider to fall into, or at least be related to, a lot of the security measures that we have in place at unit level up to sort of strategic level. So that is, making sure people have security clearances, making sure that we put locks on all our doors, making sure that we conduct patrols of our bases to see if anyone's cut a hole in the fence. If we're going overseas, making sure that our sensitive and classified materials are appropriately stored and kept under guard, or our weapons are kept secure. Any sensitive or critical information or asset is basically safeguarded.
I think that's the thing that you talked about before with it's obvious, right? All of those things are quite obvious. We know that we do that. Sometimes we don't do it as well as we should do, but largely we know that's happening. We are locking things. We are patrolling, sort of trying to deny that physical component. It's very obvious. The less obvious stuff in that opaque, to use your words before, that opaque stuff is sort of talking about, that's where sort of the money hits the rubber hits the road in this sense, with the more sort of active but then passive measures as well.
I think, those are all the sort of bits you can see, and that's the stuff that we have in place by policy, the Defence Security Principles framework, or standing orders, or whatever it might be that governs all that. But the part you can't see is the counterintelligence activity to figure out how the enemy is looking for that stuff and collecting on it, or the sub-discipline of counter-espionage, which is where you are looking for people, mostly people, but sometimes other technical mechanisms for the theft of classified or sensitive information or assets. So that sort of covers off on the defensive aspect of the spectrum. On the other side, you've got the offensive activities. So this is where once you have identified how the enemy or the adversary is collecting on you, well, that presents you with options to push back against it. Now, in a wartime scenario, that might be drop a bomb on them, right? Pretty quick way of denying the enemy the ability to collect on you. It could be, if you're talking about a human being, it may be capturing them or conducting some sort of mission to take them out of the fight. Or then you get into the more kind of dark arts of this stuff, which is where you would feed information and conduct deception operations to effect military objectives, basically, at the end of the day. Now, probably the best example of that, the cardinal example of it, is the so-called double cross system employed by British military and civilian intelligence agencies during the Second World War. So if you think back to World War II, early part of the war, the Brits are basically cut off. All of Europe is occupied by the Germans or is neutral. But the Germans still, in the early part of the war, had their ambition to mount Operation Sea Lion, the conventional invasion of the UK. And then at the very least, they wanted to develop human agents primarily who could collect intelligence within the British Isles, because they didn't really have strong networks or anything there of their own. And of course, being an island, it's hard to get people in and out of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So the Germans infiltrated. They went out and sort of found out this motley crew of agents, people from Holland or people who said that they were fleeing Europe via Switzerland or whatever it might be, and they put them, in some cases they parachuted them in some cases they got on boats, they claimed to seek asylum and all this sort of stuff to penetrate the borders of the UK and get in there so that they could report back with old Morse code radio sets and stuff like that, information about troop movements or whatever, and the general atmospherics of what was happening in the UK back to the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr. Now, so if you're sitting on the UK side, you've got this problem where you know that the Germans are sending all these agents toward you, and Home Guard detachments and stuff are picking them up because they've jumped out of planes, and these guys are pretty hopeless and they broke their leg when they landed in the field or something like that. Now, that presents you with a couple of options, right? You could shoot them for spying, which in some cases they did. They were shot or hanged. You can just throw them in jail and say, well, we caught you, that's the end of it. Or you can do what the British did in many cases after vetting them or going through kind of exercises to determine the feasibility of this, but they grabbed the radio sets, or in some cases they turned the agents themselves. They offered them a better deal and got them to feed bogus information back to the Germans, which was voraciously consumed, to the point that by kind of the middle part of the war, the British were reasonably confident that every human agent and basically every vector that the Germans had to collect intelligence within the UK was under their control. And that was an immensely successful program and was really pivotal in allowing the deception operations and the troop movements and stuff to be done in a manner which was secret in the lead up to D-Day and so on. And Hitler himself is said to have read some of the reports that the Brits were sending back to them. So an immensely successful campaign of counterintelligence.
Feeding false information back and taking that opportunity to use double sort of cross agents and stuff. That's absolutely awesome. So we've gone through now, I talked about case studies at the start. We went through Russia, Ukraine. Now we've talked about World War II a couple of times. If we come back and we talk to individual locking, and taking protective measures on base and stuff. If we come back to Australia and the organisation more broadly, so the first question I want to ask you is what are the top counterintelligence risks that we face as an organisation in Australia to come back to our nation?
I think it's all the things that for those who've been paying attention, Director General of Security Mike Burgess has spoken about a lot in the last couple of years. So it is things like, as much as it may seem quaint or antiquated in the modern era, when you think about cyber and all this kind of more technological solutions for collection of intelligence, still a very powerful and in some ways the most damaging risk is human recruitment and penetration of organisations. We've seen multiple case studies locally and certainly a vast and disturbing number in the US, where the FBI and US counterintelligence agencies in the military services have been quite successful in wrapping up people who were acting on behalf of foreign powers and stealing classified information, or in many circumstances on behalf of a whole range of different countries. But that's like the nightmare scenario, right? If you find that you have people within your own ranks who are up to that sort of thing, and if anyone's listening who's thinking about it, it's not a good idea. You will get caught, and your life will be destroyed as a consequence of it. But I would say that's probably the main thing that we as an organisation need to worry about, in my opinion, is human penetration. And no organisation is immune. The Russians successfully were able to recruit a Green Beret captain in the US who, for I think the better part of about 10 years, was passing very sensitive information back to Russian military intelligence, being the GRU. It's really damaging stuff, and it's more than just the technical effect of, here's the battle plans for this ship that we're building, or this bomb that we're making, or whatever, or how we put the fill in this radio or something. It's also the effect upon the morale of the organisation, because the people who've worked with that individual, many of them end up scarred for life. And it's very difficult to maintain unit cohesion and so on if you have a situation like that.
Yeah, and you talked about before in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, sort of not being confident that your plans that you're generating are going to stay within your organisation. That must be demoralising, because you're going to so much effort to achieve deception and take advantage of surprise and take shock action, and yet at certain points that this could all be being leaked to the enemy or an adversary at any point.
Absolutely, and I would say that perhaps the zenith of the art of counterintelligence is in some ways convincing your adversary that you have penetrated them and generating that psychological effect, even if you haven't. And the KGB in particular were the masters of that during the Cold War. There's a quote from James Angleton, who was the CIA's head of counterintelligence for many years in the early part of the Cold War, a man who has been much maligned, to put it mildly, but he made the comment that the Soviets could make you believe whatever it is that they wanted you to believe. And that was something that I think he appreciated from his observations of Soviet KGB and Russian or Soviet military intelligence activity in the Cold War, but also from what he knew of the double-cross system during the Second World War, because he was exposed to that operation when it was ongoing. And I think he and others, especially within the US intelligence community in those early days, were in some ways disturbed. And even though they weren't the victims of it, they were the perpetrators. But like, it had such an effect. It was so devastating in its impact, and it had such an effect on the way that they viewed how the world operated, that it really damaged them in some ways, and they made some poor decisions later on as a consequence of that.
So I think you talked about the things that are obvious, and the idea of this episode is the things that are not obvious. So it may be naive of me to think this, but to think that ADF personnel or Australian government employees can be turned by foreign intelligence services is like farcical. Like I can't see that sort of happening, but I think I'm taking a too naive of approach, and that's the idea of this episode. How real is the risk of foreign intelligence services turning or having influence in that way in the ADF more specifically?
Sadly, Todd, I think you are being a bit too naive about that. It does happen, and it has happened since time immemorial. It will continue to happen as long as human fallibility and vulnerability remains a feature of the human condition. So in human intelligence terms, people often refer to the acronym of MICE: money, ideology, coercion, and ego, as being the four levers that you have to pull in getting someone to do what you want. Now, though you know, there are people who fall prey to those four vices every day of the week. It's just a matter of, can a foreign intelligence service position themselves in a way where they can actually practically leverage that from you? And unfortunately, that's become far easier nowadays than it ever was perhaps in time gone by. So to give you an example of that, in the good old days of the Cold War, there are a number of US...
I can't remember good old days in Cold War. Yeah, it's not lost to me. So.
It depends on your perspective.
Yeah, that's right.
But there are a number of US Marines, for example, US Marines, of course, have responsibility for guarding embassies across the world, US embassies, and many of them over the years were turned and recruited through a whole host of every sin and vice you can think of, you know, through honey traps involving women to try and lure these guys into situations of blackmail, or where they developed genuine feelings for a woman perhaps, and then they were coerced, situations where people were hard up for cash and they were offered payment and that sort of stuff. All these things happened like on a pretty regular basis. But as I say, in the good old days, the Foreign Intelligence Service had to establish some degree of physical proximity in order to be able to effect an approach like that, because you can't, these people aren't ghosts as much as they may attempt to be and sort of seem like it. But at the end of the day, if you really want someone to work for you, then I guess you have to put yourself in a situation where they are witting to what is going on, and therefore you can direct them to go out there and steal what you want and bring it back to you. So nowadays, we don't have to worry about, well, we still have to worry about it, but in addition to the issue of physical connection, running into someone, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or being on hostile territory, so to speak, and coming into contact with hostile actors who can form that kind of relationship or put you in an awkward position, there's also the problem of online approaches, right? So where the KGB had to run pretty intensive, in terms of manpower and time and money, operations to physically figure out a way to orchestrate some connection with someone, today you can do it with LinkedIn. You can do it with, I don't know, TikTok or whatever young people are using nowadays. The social media kind of mechanism of your choice allows you, as the foreign intelligence officer, to sit at your desk, you know, masquerading through other profiles or even using your own persona in some cases, to make connections with people on a scale and at a level of complexity which is really unparalleled. So where, you know, the Russians might have been able to go out in Moscow and bump one US Marine a day to try and get some operation up and running, today our adversaries could be sending 20,000 LinkedIn messages to ADF personnel who've put something online. And I guess this is why Director General Burgess and ASIO are so concerned about that and have been really quite clear in their messaging around that threat.
So how are foreign intelligence agencies recruiting people, making connections and stuff? We've already touched on that component, but back in Australia, for example, and then how are they getting the information out of people?
A combination of push and pull factors, right? So you often have situations where, if we're talking about espionage cases specifically, where people will volunteer their services simply because they have some gap that they're trying to fill in their own life, and it comes back to those MICE factors that I spoke about before. So somebody might be in personal distress, short of cash, and they think, well, I've got access to sensitive material, I'll go and sell that through a foreign embassy or something. Equally, someone may be disgruntled or aggrieved with their employer, and they may no longer have loyalty to that organisation. They may decide for ego reasons, ideology, revenge, whatever you want to call it, to go and work on behalf of a foreign power or a proxy. They're the kind of push factors. Often they are interspersed with the pull factors. So nowadays a pretty common topic, well recorded in open source information, is that people will be approached online. They will be given some sort of innocuous hook to make a connection with them, usually on the basis of some sort of business opportunity or something like that. So it might be as simple as, hey, Todd, we've seen you on LinkedIn. We've seen that you're a podcaster, or you ran the Army podcast. So we would like to engage you for a podcast about Australia's foreign policy or what the ADF's role in that is. And wouldn't that be great? Or could you write us a paper of 500 words and we'll pay you $500? Give us your bank account details. We'll wire the money to you. We are acting on behalf of an undisclosed market research organisation or a think tank or something like that. And so people will accept these approaches, maybe thinking they're innocuous to start with, and then eventually the situation will be ratcheted up to a position where they're asked for more probing information. And at that point, I would say that some people probably pull out. Others would have wisened up to what's going on, and they'll say, well, I don't care. I got away with it. No one seems to have been harmed. So they convince themselves that it's not that bad a thing. Or they say, damn the consequences. Like, I don't care. It's paying me money, and I might need that for some other reason anyway. So away I go. And you might say, well, that'd be pretty obvious. Like, I wouldn't be dumb enough to see that when that happens to me. Yeah, maybe not. But like, if they're sending 10,000 messages a day, well, we only need one nincompoop to accept it and get maybe one or two steps down the line. And if it's one a month, if it's one a year, that's still a pretty big problem for us and for our government.
Yeah, I suppose that's the why they do it, or we do it. That's the what they sort of
sure.
how they go about it. What about the what? What are they looking for?
Yeah, so in terms of objectives, I mean, it's extremely broad.
Yeah,
it can
that's
be.
That's the thing, you don't know. That's because it's so broad. What are they looking for? You don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, if we think about the Army as an example, then it's really a really broad spectrum of information that we all have access to as part of our daily duties, right? So it might be things like identities of ADF personnel may be of interest to enable follow-on targeting and collection activity. It might be stuff as simple as, can we get doctrine that's not available online? Can we get doctrine that is available online, depending upon what the threshold of the adversary is for that information, or their appetite for that. Of course, any technical information about our weapons. Yeah,
capability seems really like ranges, length of time in flight, all that sort of stuff. It seems obvious.
Yep.
Less obvious stuff, I suppose, is.
I would say, stuff around Australian strategic and foreign policy seems to be a repeated theme of the cases that have come out in open source or Western foreign policy and strategic policy, I should say, rather than Australian specifically. But it's really a huge grab bag of stuff. The requirements might be tailored for the opportunity that presents. So if it's someone who's a RAMI officer, they might say, okay, well, can you get us the manuals to do with these trucks or something like that, because that's of interest. There was an interesting US case involving a fellow who was charged only recently, a US Navy sailor. He didn't hand over any information that was secret or top secret, but he did hand over controlled, unclassified information which related to the propulsion system and the I'm not a Navy guy, but the manuals that you have for running the engineering subsystems on a ship. He handed that over for a US Navy vessel.
So that's all the stuff. So if we now shift focus to some sort of a case study in our own sense, I know you would probably draw on some World War II examples in this case study, but I suppose if we deploy to a near region island to our north, during a time of heightened tension, or even you talked about they're not needing to be a high level of tension to be able to do counterintelligence or gather intelligence as well. What counterintelligence considerations would come into play, especially in terms of like partner forces, open source exposure, or social media as well? And you talk about flooding with propaganda to try to deceive the adversary as to what is real and what is not, what sort of things, if we were to deploy into the near region, would come to play?
If some contingency were to arise in Southwest Pacific or Southeast Asia, I think there's a number of key features of the environment that pertain to counterintelligence. The first is the ubiquity of collectors in that environment. It is a guarantee that today or in the future, or if we were to go back and look, 20 years ago or whatever, insert date here, there would be foreign intelligence services and in some cases foreign military organisations who've got people and sensors out there looking to collect on stuff. So if you're going into that environment as part of a deployment or something, you have to accept that as the baseline level of activity. There is no doubt about that. The second feature is, I think, the complex human terrain in the region. So we have a vast number of different ethnicities, different tribal groups in some areas, different languages, different types of individual national cultures or subcultures. All of those elements can be they might be leveraged by us to gain partner force equities and exposure and alliances and stuff in the region, but they are also pertinent as vectors for potential targeting, recruitment, and then collection by the enemy on what we're doing, right? So any cleavage in society, any aggrieved individual or organisation or ethnic group may be fodder for intelligence activity, and therefore the job of counterintelligence would be to identify that and try and neutralise it. And then I would say the third thing is the complexity of the technical nature of the environment into which we would be going. So it's not just that human aspect, as important as that may be. It's things like overhead sensors, satellite collection, mobile phone telephony networks, tapping of undersea cables and all that type of stuff that where your communications and your information conduits and access to information may be usurped, intercepted, tampered with, or whatever as a result of what foreign intelligence services or military forces are up to.
That's the near region sort of going in and sort of with working with allied forces as well, and is working in environments where the human terrain is complex. You just talked about that, then the technical terrain and stuff as well. If we come back to what can we do about it, I suppose when we go overseas, we often get briefs and it's like very obvious what you can and can't talk about, despite the fact that there are still errors made. I'm not that naive in that sense, but despite errors being made, it's very obvious. We go overseas, we're not allowed to talk about this and this. It's obvious, right? But what is, I suppose, most exaggerated in this podcast is it's the less obvious stuff that really matters. What are your sort of 2 or 3 big tips about protecting the organisation and our secrets and the information that might not even just be secret, but paints a picture, a part of a picture that gives a larger understanding of the way we'll go about things or our capabilities? What are your 3 top tips for counterintelligence and sort of protecting the organisation?
Yeah, I think as a general rule or proposition, people should guard jealously their own personal information, right? What they put out there on social media, what they load onto their phones and all that sort of stuff. You have to be cognizant of that in the modern digital world that we live in. And if you don't, you risk foreign intelligence services taking an active interest in you. I think a really important point is not so much what are the hidden things out there that you don't see, because there's not much you can do about those, right? Like you won't see or report on what you can't or what you don't observe. But when you do see something, you have to be really forensic in the way in which you report it, because all of this stuff, from an Army-specific point of view, from an ADF point of view, from a Defence Security Division point of view, or from a whole of government and ASIO point of view, it really relies upon accurate information being fed up when people see something which is off or where they get approached in these types of situations that we've spoken about. So over the years, I've seen a lot of reports saying, we went to country X and there was some guy in the hotel lobby looking at us cockeyed when we came down to get breakfast in the morning. The end. And it's like, well, were you in uniform? Were you the only Caucasian person in a country of other ethnicities? Were you behaving in a brash manner, watching the State of Origin on TV while drinking beer or something? Like, is there a reason why someone would, a normal person with no hostile intent would come to that conclusion? Like, that's the type of detail that analysts need when they're looking at this stuff to make a determination as to whether this is hostile collection or not. And I would say that's a general shortcoming of a lot of the reporting that we get and that I've seen.
This seems obvious as well, but is it better to over-report and then let the analysts do that work rather than if something throws up your spidey senses and you're like, that seems very odd, is it better to just report in the forensic detail that you talked about, all of the things and considerations behind the scenario that you're in that made you feel that way, rather than thinking like, I don't want to bother someone else, or like more broadly, I don't think it's that significant. I suppose being an intelligence officer, you'd like prefer that people report everything.
100%, because you never know what other details out there, right? So there may be other reports that you're not privy to, which piece together your part of the jigsaw puzzle to form that overall picture. So if that reporting doesn't come in, then we can't make those connections. I think that's an often underappreciated aspect of this. And also, if we come down to back to the detail within the reports, it's like, I don't know if they still teach this to IETs or whatever, but like the old salute him acronym, record. There was some guy looking at me funny or doing something on their phone, or I observed this thing, a car acting unusually. Well, what's the number plate?
Yeah.
What did they look like? What were they wearing?
How many were there?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which direction were they heading in? What time of day did you see them? It's no good to just say, I saw something weird, I reported it, and away I go. That's not actionable information. You can't do anything with that. And it's very hard then to sift through that to find the nuggets that we need to link with other stuff.
Yeah. I think on leadership, well, I'm an instructor at ADFA and we did Leadership Challenge 3. We talked about giving the cadets some tactical tasks, one of which was I won't go through a amount of detail, but they were to sort of hand over with the dagger call sign. I don't know why that was dagger either. I didn't design the scenario, but the dagger call sign that was Special Forces on top of a feature. And they were to go into the admin layout point, establish and hand over with the dagger 2-0 for this instance, and then crawl into an observation post and observe a control point down there, or checkpoint at the bottom of the forward slope of the feature. Then this call sign steps off and the section commander gets a little bit lost because they're just learning navigation skills and stuff. And they go to the forward slope of this feature and straight into the checkpoint. And they start asking questions like, are you dagger 2-0? That is a terrible question to ask someone that has no idea why they're there and what, because they're going to say yes. And then the trainee...
Maybe they were just being polite.
Yeah, and then the trainee continues to ask... are we handing over this observation post with you? And the adversary at the time said, yes, you are. And then subsequently, you could imagine how that scenario unfolded. But giving away too much information, you know more than you think you do, and giving away far too much information in that sense is just it serves no purpose for anyone. You should be asking sort of probing questions rather than leading people into scenarios where they can obviously deceive you 100%.
Yeah, I think... a term I heard recently, which really applies in this context of operational security and the sort of things you were alluding to there, Todd, is it's a safety term used by a lot of big companies in the safety context, but it's chronic unease. So you can't afford to be complacent. If you see, in a safety situation, a dripping tap or something, it's like, well, that could be foreshadow a pipe exploding or whatever. And it's kind of the same with this security stuff, right? So if you have that sense of chronic unease, if you have that sense of continual maintenance and continuous kind of improvement around what you're doing, and you're constantly looking out for that sort of stuff, maintaining situational awareness as it pertains to security, then you will stop, egregiously stupid things like that happening. But you will also be better positioned, I think, to look for the really bad stuff that's going on out there and to find the indicators of that activity occurring. And I've used this analogy with other people before, but as a general soldier or officer, we're not expecting you to be an expert in counterintelligence. We're not going to put a fedora on you and a trench coat and send you out into the wilds to hunt down foreign spies or something. But what we do expect is that if there is a fire, you should at least be able to see the flames. You should at least be able to smell the smoke and to call the fire brigade. And then experts can be brought in to deal with that problem. But if you can't even recognize, or if you're too, complacent, lazy, naive, whatever it is to make those reports, well, then the fire brigade won't arrive, right? And then we've got a big problem.
I think that's an excellent place to leave the episode. That's excellent. So that's counterintelligence, protecting the organisation and our secrets, capability, the obvious stuff, but more importantly, the opaque or less obvious stuff. Thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely awesome.
Thank you. Hope it was informative.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.